Hey everybody, how you doing? This is Brad Listi. This is the Otherppl show. I am here in Los Angeles and it is good to be with you. Thanks for listening. Today on the program, my guest is Pulitzer Prize winner Elizabeth Strout, author of the new novel Lucy by the Sea.
After I won the Pulitzer Prize, I was frightened because I thought now people will look at what I'm going to write. But then very shortly, I realized, I've always held myself to the highest standard. That reader presence that I have in front of me, I've always held myself to the highest standard that I can. I'm just as much of a perfectionist as I can be to try and get it right. And so that won't change, whether it's one reader or 100 readers. I understood, because I was older too, I wasn't, thrown by it, I think, in the way that I might have been if I was younger.
All right. That was Elizabeth Strout, Pulitzer Prize winner and author of the new novel Lucy by the Sea. Just published yesterday, September 20th, 2022. It's available now wherever books are sold from Random House. Lucy by the Sea is a beautiful novel, masterfully crafted, both in its renderings of the physical world and in particular in its renderings of character. It's just lovely. For me, Elizabeth Strout is incredible when it comes to creating characters who seem vividly real on the page, emotionally and psychologically complex in ways that are both instantly recognizable and also startlingly new at the level of insight. Her characters are totally distinct, and it's uncanny how real they seem. She is a writer who has remarkable access to her characters and to the world that she has created for them. And Lucy by the Sea is propulsive literary fiction. It draws you right in from page one. It doesn't pull any punches, and it is just so emotionally involving. And the prose is clear as a bell, which as a writer I always aspire to, and as a reader I always appreciate. It's like the old James Baldwin line. What is it? Sentences as clean as a bone. This is what it's like to read the work of Elizabeth Strout. So much care is placed in every line, and there is the sense that there is no wasted motion. So, what else can I say? I loved Lucy by the Sea. I tore through it, and I was kind of sad when it was done, which I think is another one of the effects of Elizabeth Strout's work, because these characters seem so real. This world, it's so real, it's so lived in, that when the book is over, you miss it. And you miss the people. Lucy by the Sea is the fourth novel by Elizabeth Strout that features as its protagonist a writer named Lucy Barton. Many of you out there who are listening are probably familiar with Lucy Barton, who is a wonderful heroine and a great set of eyes through which to experience the milieu of Liz Strout's fiction, which tends to center on New England and Maine in particular, but also in this case, New York City. Lucy by the Sea is, in a nutshell, about Lucy Barton and her ex-husband, William, who was her first husband. And it's about how they end up living together during the pandemic. So this is a very contemporary story with recent history on its mind, and it has a lot of other things going on, which you will hear Elizabeth Strout and I talk about, and which you should experience for yourself by reading the novel. My conversation with Elizabeth Strout is coming up in just a couple of minutes. For those of you out there who might be new to this program, the Otherppl podcast is offered freely. It is a weekly show that launched in 2011. New episodes drop every Wednesday. The official website for the show is otherppl.com. You can listen to the entire archive free of charge. There are nearly 800 episodes and counting. Past guests on this program include writers like Susan Orlean, Min-Jin Lee, Jonathan Franzen, Roxane Gay, Bret Easton Ellis, Hanya Yanagihara, George Saunders, Jesmyn Ward, Chuck Klosterman, and more. I also want to let you know that I do a weekly email newsletter. It is free. It's once a week. I basically share a list of things that I'm reading or finding interesting. You can subscribe to my weekly newsletter at otherppl.com or at my website, bradlisti.com. It's the same newsletter in both places. The Other People podcast has social media feeds. If you want to follow those, you can follow the show on Twitter at otherppl or on Instagram at otherppl.podcast. If you are a listener of this program on a regular basis and you like what you're hearing, I hope you will rate and review the show wherever you listen. That helps new listeners find the show. Last but not least, I have a novel out. It's called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. It published earlier this year. If you want to check that out, you can visit bradlisti.com or track it down wherever you get your books. It's available in trade paperback, ebook, and audiobook editions. I narrate the audiobook. Once again, it's called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. Today's episode is brought to you by The Feminist Press, publisher of a new story collection by Luke Danny Blue called Pretend It's My Body. This is Luke's debut, and it is informed by their experiences in and between genders. Pretend It's My Body is a debut story collection that blurs fantasy and reality, excavating new meanings from our varied dysphorias. Luke Danny Blue invites the reader into a world of outlier lives made central and magical thinking made real. This is a surreal, darkly humorous, and always deeply felt collection. Pretend It's My Body is bound together by the act of searching for a spark of recognition and a story of one's own. That's Pretend It's My Body by Luke Danny Blue, available now from The Feminist Press. Okay, so today's guest, once again, is Elizabeth Strout, author of the new novel Lucy by the Sea, available now from Random House. Elizabeth Strout is from Maine. She was born in Portland and grew up in small towns in both Maine and New Hampshire. Her other books include O. William, which has been shortlisted for the 2022 Booker Prize, Olive Again, Anything is Possible, which won the Story Prize, a novel called My Name is Lucy Barton, The Burgess Boys, Olive Kittredge, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, Abide With Me, and Amy and Isabel, which won the Los Angeles Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction and the Chicago Tribune Heartland Prize. Elizabeth Strout has also been a finalist for the Penn Faulkner Award and the Orange Prize in London. So, quite a career, and certainly one of our more accomplished and celebrated contemporary authors. And I'm just thrilled to have her here on the Other People podcast and to get to share this conversation with all of you right now. Here she is, folks. This is Elizabeth Strout, and her new novel, one more time, is called Lucy by the Sea.
The reason I wrote this book is because I had literally just finished O. William, which is about Lucy and William on a road trip through Maine. And I had just finished that book when the pandemic began. And it even occurred to me to make an epilogue of the book before I turned it in. But then I realized I liked the way that O. William ended, and I didn't want to have the reader turn the page and find another, a continuation of her voice. So I just started the book having no idea where the pandemic was going or what was happening. And so I have never written so closely to what was actually occurring in real life before. So I would write different scenes, but they were still so much in my head that I thought, okay, let's I can't pretend this isn't happening. This is happening in the world. So let's get William, take her off to the coast of Maine and stick them together in this house on a cliff and see what happens.
And you were really, in some ways, writing it in real time.
Yeah.
Rather than maybe keeping like a daily diary of what was happening, you were just sitting down to write your novel, and probably things that were happening that same day, you might have worked their way into the story.
Right, or a few days later or something, because I write in scenes. I don't write from beginning to end anyway, but I would try and capture a feeling from Lucy's point of view, that had occurred.
Okay, and I was going to get to this, but I figure since you brought it up, we'll talk about it. The fact that you write in scenes rather than writing in a linear narrative the way that a lot of people do. This is kind of like, I know there are probably other authors that do this, but this is sort of your method, and it works for you. And for listeners, many of whom are writers or aspiring writers, be good to hear you maybe flesh this out a little bit more. Like, you will sit down, write a scene. I think I've read where you say you see if it has a pulse.
Yeah.
And if it has a heartbeat, and if it has a heartbeat, then you have confidence that you'll be able to find a way to string it and connect it to another scene with a heartbeat, essentially.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I learned that many, many years ago when the time that I had to write was very limited. And I just finally realized one day, wait a minute, what's the point in writing a wooden scene if I know I'm going to probably cut it anyway? Let's just go straight to any scene that has a heartbeat, anything that I'm feeling that I can push and transpose into a character, and it would help. It helped a tremendous amount, and that's when I began to realize after a while, if they do have a heartbeat, the scenes will very often connect in some sort of way. But I don't do it from start to finish. It's a mess.
Well, but I bet there's probably some lovely surprises when it comes to the connection part, when you find the ways that these things string together. I'm just imagining, but...
It's very surprising. Right. I mean, the last page of Olive Kittredge, the very last page I had written way before I had even written that story. I just had this scene, and it was so vivid, and I wrote it down, and thank goodness I didn't throw it away, or it ended up, I was able to find it, because I'd even written end ? On the top of the page, and then when I got to that story, I thought, wait a minute, I know the end. Where's the ending? And I found it.
And there it was.
There it was.
So this book, it's interesting for a lot of reasons. One of the things that I kept noticing as I read was what you didn't say. Like, it's as notable for what it does say as much as it is for what it doesn't say.
Right.
And I couldn't help but flag that you don't mention Trump by name until, I believe, like page 160.
Is his name in there?
I mean, or maybe like the current president is what you say.
The current president.
Yeah, so like the political realities of the time are at a remove. And I think it's right around that 160 page mark where finally it starts to enter the conversation. And I want to have you read from that part of the novel because it brought things into focus for me. And I think it's a really interesting creative choice. So if you could just read that, that would be great.
Along those lines, this is important, I think. I need to tell you about one summer evening. William and I took a drive after we ate dinner. It was still light out, and we stopped at a roadside place that was selling ice cream. The place that sold the ice cream was a small blue shack with a lot of lawn around it, and a tree stood in the middle of the lawn. When we first got there, people, not many, were milling about on the lawn, and we got out of the car and stood in line at a safe distance from the woman ahead of us who wore no mask. The woman who was serving the ice cream was not a young woman, and she wore a mask, but she wore it below her nose, and I wondered if William would say we shouldn't get ice cream from her, but he said nothing, and this is what I want to say. An old man with a white beard was sitting on a stool beneath the tree, playing the guitar and singing a song, and there was another man who had just gotten his ice cream. Even I could tell immediately that he was from out of state, maybe even New York, and the car he got into was expensive looking and slung low to the ground, but I could not see the license plates. This man wore dark pink shorts and a blue-collared shirt tucked into them, and he wore loafers with no socks, and I heard behind me some people speaking of him, fucking out-of-stater. And I turned, And they were men who wore no masks who had said that, and they looked a little frightening to me. And then the woman ahead of me in line, who was not wearing a mask, saw another woman who got out of her car, and they threw their arms around each other and said, "Hi." What I am trying to say is that for a few minutes, I had what almost felt like a vision, that there was a deep, deep unrest in the country, and that the whisperings of a civil war seemed to move around me like a breeze I could not quite feel but could sense. We got our ice cream and we left, and I told William what I had felt, and he said, "I know." It has stayed with me, that feeling I had that evening.
So for me as a reader, the fact that you kept the president and the politics out of it, and yet everything that was happening against that backdrop, it almost made it feel like a ghost story in some way, or there was some kind of eerie effect that it delivered. And when I got to that passage, it sort of turned the dial and brought that into focus. It was you finally said the quiet part out loud.
Right.
And I just like to hear about that choice, that creative choice to sort of leave the politics out of it, focus on the personal, and tell this human story without kind of getting into the weeds, even though the reader can kind of feel it humming in the background.
Right. Well, Lucy, and this was true in O. William, Lucy during her lifetime has sometimes had visions. And so I thought, okay, this is perfect. We can make this feel almost like a vision that Lucy is having, because she seems to have access to things that other people don't have sometimes. So in that choice of making it feel almost like a vision to Lucy, I was able to present it to the reader with, this is what Lucy felt.
Did you, in any earlier draft or in any discarded scenes, did you get more explicitly political and then make the decision to remove that? Or was it always the case that you were going to be?
I did make the decision to remove it. There were more scenes of, head-on political stuff. And then as I was understanding the book and understanding Lucy more, I realized, because it's so interesting when you find that you put little hints to yourself along the way that you don't even know. Like I realized at the very beginning when Lucy doesn't want to see the computer that William shows her about Elsie Waters having died at the very beginning of the book, I realized, okay, so Lucy is a person who looks away. She can barely watch the news. She can barely watch, she doesn't watch the Capitol building. And that was very helpful to me as I realized, okay, this is Lucy's story. And Lucy herself ends up saying, "I look away." Like she's like Mildred, the woman that was very nice to her as a child at the, Thanksgiving dinners, who would look away at the house her husband had died in. And Lucy's mother had been so nasty about that. But Lucy recognizes this in herself, that I look away. So I thought, okay, then this is Lucy's story from Lucy's point of view. We can have her looking away, and therefore we don't need to include all their political scenes that I had put in.
I feel like you are a person who does not look away.
No, I don't look away, but Lucy does. So that was helpful.
Yeah. Well, and I think speaking of looking away, there is, and this has been noted by people who have read your work for a while now, that you have an incredible facility at drawing characters and at creating on the page a feeling of deep and almost like shockingly immediate intimacy would be the way that I put it to myself as I was reading, because I was like, man, I feel like by page 3, I was in these people's lives. Like you got me there. You got me there very quickly. And I know that you are a careful looker. You're a careful observer, as anyone who's good with character tends to be. But when it comes to creating vivid characters on the page, I'm wondering if there's anything else that you do. Like, do you create character bios prior to writing?
No, I don't. I just think about them. It's a matter of concentrating so deeply. I just think and think and think about who they are and go down and down and down into them. Just really blocking out the rest of the world while I'm concentrating that hard. It's a process of concentrating. And then I feel that I can know them and put them on the page.
It reminds me of that scene when Lucy is in her study above the bookstore and she's sitting in the overstuffed chair. And she's just thinking about, what is it, arms and legs, or the character.
And legs, right.
Right. And so That's interesting. And so I suppose like once you've done that deep, concentrative thinking about the character, you get the basics of who they are nailed down. And then once you're in the actual writing process, there's some flexibility still. They can still surprise you, right?
Oh, and they do all the time. And I'm thrilled when they do, because if I'm not surprised, you won't be surprised. You know?
Sure, yeah. And, you know, you say when you like reflect on your work, or you have said that it always starts with a character. Like some writers start with an idea, you start with people every time.
Yeah, always. It's only because I don't think there's anything more fascinating for me in the world than people. So that's what drives me every time.
And you've also said that Lucy Barton allows you to look at the really quiet parts of living. Like, what is it about her that gives you access to that aspect of the human experience? Is there something, is it just the fact that she's a writer herself, or is it something else?
Well, you know, Lucy came to me as quite a surprise. I mean, when I wrote My Name is Lucy Barton, it was really, I wasn't intending to, I was working on something else, and it just came to me. But she arrived through her voice. And I didn't want to write from a first person narrator. I usually do third person, you know, omniscient. And so I tried not to, but her voice was like a gold thread that was just sort of coming down in front of me. And she is her voice. And I realized, okay, well, if I get her voice down, then I actually have this person. And she was so accessible to me once I allowed myself to find that voice and to hang on to it. And she was very surprising for me because she's so, there's a breathiness to her voice, you know, a kind of an urgency, a quiet urgency to her voice. And her interior life allows her to be honest with herself. You know, I think of her as an honest person. And so her observations are quick and immediate. And I don't know how to describe her.
I was thinking of like this juxtaposition of fragility and strength. There's something sort of fragile about her, but she's also very strong and willing to kind of look at the hard things.
That's actually really, I think you're absolutely right about that. She's fragile, but she's really strong. I mean, like she can bend, but she doesn't break. And,
you know, you've talked about, because you published your first novel at age 42, correct?
Right.
So, you know, it wasn't like you were some wonderkin that came out the box at like age 22 with the debut. You took a long road and you've had great success. And everybody's got their own path. I think it's heartening to hear stories like that, because I think the culture kind of tells us if it doesn't happen by the time we're X, then it's not going to happen. And you're a great counterpoint to that. And something that you said was that you can't, or something that you have said is that you can't write fiction and be careful. And you then said, I probably was careful for too long. Can you talk about what you know, a little bit more deeply about what you meant by that? And then, you know, what changed with your debut when you finally broke through?
I think that I was always, I think for many years, as I look back, I was trying to write like a writer. And I think that was the problem, because every time I sat down, I thought, does this sound like a writer? And then I realized finally, no, this has to sound like me. This has to be my writerly voice, not anybody else's. You know, so the attempt to barricade myself off from my real subjects or my real desires to put on the page something that was real was sort of barricaded because I kept thinking I need to sound like a writer. And then finally, when I was able to write Amy and Isabel, I realized, no, this is my voice and I can write anything I need to. So that was my breakthrough.
And also, you know, probably nobody's going to read this anyway. And then it goes on to become a bestseller.
I thought, well, nobody's going to read this anyway, so just say what you want to say. So I did.
and you have continued to.
Yes, exactly.
Do you feel like you're getting do you feel like you're getting better at that, like having that sense of abandon and the willingness to risk?
Yeah, I do, because, you know, it's just time's short and it's getting shorter, and I might as well just say whatever it is I think needs to be said for my readers to be able to take something truthful in.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny because I think so many of us who write struggle with that, especially when we think of the people in our lives that we're close to family,
Right.
family and friends, what are they going to think? And then
Right.
you say it, you put a book together and you put it out into the world, and it says all these quote unquote unspeakable things. And I found that like the reaction tends to be a little bit surprising. It's not always exactly what you would think. Like certain people might have trouble with it who you didn't think they would, and then other people who you were anticipating a negative response from are fine with it.
Yeah, exactly. That you're absolutely right. And that, has happened and I have become okay about it.
And one of the things I noticed about Lucy by the Sea, I talked about how there was this like just this immediate, like crazy fast sense of intimacy that I developed. And I think maybe the reason for that, the most primary reason, is that you really lead with a strong punch and you tell the reader the stakes in plain terms right away. Like there's a lot of information coming at the reader in those first few pages, but you get a kind of almost a complete sense of the terrain right away. You don't hold back.
Right. Right. Because I want the reader to be positioned. I think it's very important that a reader get positioned right away. And I think about the reader all the time while I'm writing. I always have a reader in mind. I always have. So for me, it's never like I'm just working myself. I'm working always with the reader. And so I think, okay, what does the reader need to know? Well, they need to know this. Just put it out there, let them know that, and then we'll move on.
Do you have an ideal reader that you write to? Like, do you write to a spouse or a friend or somebody like that, or is it more abstract?
It's more abstract. It's a reader I've had for years. I remember many years ago I realized, well, if I can make up people, I can make up a reader. So I made up a reader, and the reader has no gender, but it's really sort of right in front of me. And it's a person who's patient, but not super patient. It's a person who's, kind of willing to go with me, but I have to be responsible. And so it's my sense of responsibility to that reader that I am aware of all the time. Like, what do you need now? And if you go with me, I want you to feel safe, even though we might look at things that aren't safe, but you will be safe. You'll be in safe hands.
And what about being a writer who has become so associated with place? I've read that you're not in love with the idea of being considered like a Maine writer.
No.
But I have to cop to it. I just feel like you own that place. Like there's something kind of nice about owning it, right?
Well,
can you talk about that? Talk about that. Like what are the downsides?
Well, I think it was Marjorie Rawlings who said that if you're a regional writer, you've become quaint. And I somehow came across that quote one day and I thought, well, she's right. So I don't want to be a regional writer. I want to be a writer for anybody who can receive it, in the world. But I come from many generations of Maine, and I have very ambivalent feelings about that. Unlike my family, who is very proud of it for some reason. And I'm just always objected to the chauvinism of their attitude, like, oh, well, we're from Maine. I just can't bear it. So I have ambivalent feelings about Maine.
And yet your work is shot through with it. And I think, even though there is a very distinct like New England sensibility, I say this as a reader who's never lived, or as a person who's never lived in New England, has spent minimal time in New England, though I walked the Appalachian Trail in Maine, so I have spent time in Maine. But to me, I was like, wow, I just feel like this is so New England as I was reading it. Like it just feels like so of that place. And yet I'm not from there. I was completely absorbed with the story at the human level too. So I think your work succeeds in both ways is what I'm saying. Like I think obviously people from all over the place are responding to it and finding themselves in it, even though it's distinctly New England in its sensibility in ways that, I mean, you just can't extract yourself from. That's where you're from, right?
Right. It's exactly where I'm from. And one of the really fun things about writing this book for me was to look at all the landscape through Lucy's eyes, because she's never seen the coast of Maine. And for me, it's like looking at my arm. It's just like I know it so well, it's like, but then I realized, okay, so Lucy has never seen this. And I would walk around or drive around and think, okay, Lucy's eyes. And it was unbelievably interesting for me to really see an entirely, well, not different, but you know what I mean, to have a different point of view from experiencing it from her point of view for the first time.
It's kind of lovely, the coast of Maine.
It was lovely. It's sort of changed my feelings about Maine.
And a place that I think a lot of people might have, I mean, myself included, might have fantasized about in the age of COVID, or places like it where you have
Right.
some space, you have some
Right.
fresh air, you can
Right.
get outside a little bit. And, there's a great tension in the book because Lucy, has a place in New York City. She comes to Maine from New York City and she's sort of a city person. And there is this tension that I would imagine is real, among Mainers between,
Right.
the people who are kind of native and who live there versus the people who come up in the summers from the big cities. That's a pretty dramatic tension. There's some real animosity there.
There is tension about that. There absolutely. Yeah. It was interesting because I was talking to a woman in England the other day, and she said that during COVID, there was the same tension that happened there. Londoners who were moving out, to the more rural areas. And so I think it's probably not just unique to Maine and New York, but to city versus, the provinces.
Yeah, I've thought about that. Like it's just having like California license plates.
Right.
I was reading a story about like Montana. Like everybody was moving to Bozeman, during the pandemic or whatever, and people in Bozeman were, not a fan of people with California plates. I was imagining what that must be like.
It's just like with the New York plates. Yeah, I got it.
So, this set of novels that you've published, you've kind of built like a universe, it feels like. It's like a universe that your characters inhabit. They appear, like Olive Kittredge makes a cameo in this book. You've created this fictional town of Crosby, Maine. And I'm wondering how much of that was premeditated or versus how much of that just kind of emerged through the creative process, perhaps as a surprise to you.
It was totally a surprise to me. When I wrote Amy and Isabel, I had no idea that these characters would continue to show up with me or continue on. I had no intention of writing Olive again. I thought Olive was finished. But I think my personal feeling is that because I do concentrate so much on these people and I just think about them so much that they become very, very real to me. And then as I'm writing something, I realize, oh, well, Bob Burgess lives here now. Let's put him in, so.
By the way, I want to interrupt you. I love Bob Burgess as a character. He is a lovely human being.
Isn't he just the nicest man? Thank you. I just think he's wonderful. Such a man. But anyway, and then I just realized it sort of grew organically, but then I began to realize, wow, it's all here. Like I can do this because they're all going to be here for one reason or another. And then the fact that William brings Lucy to the coast of Maine, toward the end of the book, you understand that there's a little question about why he brought her to Maine because of his sister, his, half-sister, and how much, as his daughter said, that worked out for him. So, it wasn't like I just brought them to Maine for no reason. I mean, because he could have taken her to Montauk or someplace else. And so but he had that half-sister up here. So, he might have been hoping, and he probably was hoping, and it did work out for him. So anyway, it just seemed to me to be organically possible for all these people to be together.
Yeah, no, I love that. It's like its own, it's its own world. And
Right.
I want to talk to you about the relationship between Lucy and William, which I love because I don't see it often in fiction,
Right.
where you have divorced characters
Right.
many years past their breakup who are amicable and affectionate with one another and have developed what I would characterize as like a really adult perspective
Exactly.
on the whole state of affairs. And it was just refreshing to me. I was like, oh, like, cause usually it's like in popular fiction or narratives in movies or whatever, they're always at each other's throats and they hate each other. And, it's just this kind of ice storm of human behavior, but that's not the case here.
When I was writing this book and as I wrote their dialogue to each other, it was so fun because I realized, wow, these people really know each other in a way that is kind of unique. And they know each other in a way that transcends the fact that they met when they were young. They just somehow have understood each other on some level for many years, and now they're stuck together and they continue to understand each other through the dialogue. It was interesting to me to see that.
Well, and also I think it's like, it makes me think of the way time works its magic.
Yeah.
You know, things can be really sour in a breakup or a divorce, and then, you know, you give it 25
Yeah.
years and things can
Yeah.
change dramatically in ways that you would never believe possible.
Exactly. And Lucy is open-hearted. I mean, they're both decent. From my point of view, they're both decent people. You know, Lucy is perfectly open-hearted, and William, he doesn't, you know, he says, yours is the life I wanted to save. So they have a very deep affection or love. I think, you know, love for each other.
So I want to get back a little bit to this idea of saying the unspeakable and drawing that intimacy on the page that I think is one of the main reasons why so many people respond to your work. You're so good at that. And early on, I think it was early on, might even have preceded Amy and Isabel, your debut, you took a stand-up comedy class?
Yeah.
Okay, so talk to me about that. That was that before the debut?
Yeah, it was. I did it because, well, I was interested in comedy ever since I moved to New York. I would go to the different comedy clubs. And what I began to understand right away is that people laughed because something that was said was true. And that would bring out the laughter because somebody would say something unspeakable, but it would be true. So I thought to myself, well, what would happen if I put myself in that kind of pressure cooker where I was immediately responsible for making people laugh? What would come out of my mouth? So, because I could sense that all my work, and I was working on writing forever, but I could tell that there was something not truthful about it, something even though I didn't know what. So I took a class at the New School, and it was really terrifying. You know, every week somebody else would drop out, but I mean, particularly for somebody like me, it was really, really horrifying. But those of us who made it through the class for our final had to perform at the comedy club in, I think it's East 88th Street or something. So I did. And my whole thing was about making fun of myself as a white woman from Maine. And they laughed. Oh my God, thank God they laughed. Dear.
You killed.
I did. I was asked to come back and audition for a regular spot. And I said, no, I would die. I would be dead if I had done that because it took so much out of me. It was just so terrifying. But they did laugh. So, but the whole point is that I learned through that I was a white woman from New England. And that it sounds so stupid, but I honestly didn't know it. That's how white I was, and that's how much from New England I was, that I didn't know it until I was making fun of myself, you know, having lived in New York for a while and seen many different other cultures, that that's actually what I was, and making fun of myself for it. So I realized, okay, I'm a white woman from New England, then I'm going to write about a really uptight white woman from New England, and there's Isabel Goodrow. An uptight white woman from New England with a single daughter. She has no idea what to do with her, and that was that. So it was actually, my instincts to do it were right, but it was a really terrifying experience.
I imagine, do you have any of your jokes? Like, do you have any of your jokes offhand? You want to do some of your routine?
Not even remotely. I actually destroyed my husband had the videotape and he had put on a disc. And I destroyed it. I don't want anybody to ever see it.
I'm imagining you as a deadpan delivery, like almost like Stephen Wright or something. Like I'm seeing that. Is that how you were on stage?
I don't really know. It was all a blur to me. I remember some people talking about Diane Keaton a little bit, but I have no idea.
That's interesting. I've thought about that. And I actually have talked to a writer. I had a writer on this show years ago who wrote a book about a stand-up comedian and really did experiential research and got into the scene and was performing at open mics. And that makes a lot of sense to me. There's a real logic to this idea that by taking yourself way out of your comfort zone,
right,
and by actively working to say the unspeakable and to get at the core of your personal truth, that you would have a creative breakthrough that has really not just led to the first novel, but has led to all of them.
Right, exactly. Just accepting this is what I am.
So maybe if you're listening out there, it might be time to sign up for a stand-up comedy class. So you had a pretty austere upbringing in a manner similar to Lucy Barton. And one of the things I read when I was prepping was that you said about your parents, my father was probably more decent, but my mother was more interesting.
Yeah.
Your mother is, and I think a lot of times writers have this. They have one of their parents, or some, it's usually one of the parents, is the parent from whom they get their writerly
Yeah.
bearing from. And it seems like
Right.
your mother was the one who gave it to you.
Yes. Yes, I think she was, and it took me years to realize. I think that she probably wanted to be a writer herself. She taught writing at the University of New Hampshire. She taught writing in high school, expository writing, not fiction writing. But she, I think, wanted to be a writer, and she was the one who started me off as a very young child, telling me to write down what I had done that day. But also, she was a storyteller. I mean, she could tell a story. I mean, years later, I recognized her talent. She could tell a story that would start and go in a whole different direction, and then she would wind it back without even knowing that she was doing this. So it came to her naturally. And I always found her fascinating because she could do that, tell such stories.
And you had a lot of books around you as a kid?
Yes, we had books. We didn't have, and I had a piano, but we didn't have TV or anything.
Yeah, I read that when you got to college, you had only seen 2 movies, 101
Yeah.
Dalmatians and The Miracle Worker.
Yeah.
How do you think of that now? I mean, I guess it formed you. It formed you as a writer, or helped.
Me as a writer, but I was very, very glad to bring up my daughter in New York City. Let me just say that.
Right.
To be a member of the world. It was just who my parents were in the whole heritage of that Puritan culture that, had come from Scotland and England so many years ago. It was just part of that was continuing on. And I think I've said that they were skeptical of pleasure.
And it's interesting to be an outlier in your family. I've kind of felt a little bit of this in my own family because I'm the writer and there's really not another writer, and I just feel a little bit like the oddball.
Yeah.
And you wonder why. Is it how, if you came from all this deeply rooted New England puritanical, like this gene pool, like you're the outlier.
Right.
How did it happen?
I know. And I used to think, even when I was younger, there was some strange mutation of genes that took place to produce me, because I just never felt like I was from here, although I obviously am. And I felt like I wasn't in the family I was supposed to be in, but I was, and there we are.
It's not the first time I've heard that.
No.
And another thing is that, like, I've talked to a lot of writers who, like, from a very young age were just like, I need to be somewhere else. I need to be in New York, is a lot of times what people say to me.
Just couldn't wait to get out. I just couldn't wait.
Was there anything, like, aside from maybe like, a quirk in your genetic makeup or something, was there anything that you could point to as a child that you either read or were exposed to or heard about, or was there a person in your life who might have opened things up a little bit for you that gave you a wider sense of perspective and possibility?
I think the books I read gave me that, because I read grown-up books. We didn't really have children's books, and my mother wasn't interested in children or children's books, but she did have, adult books. And so I read from a very young age, and that was my opening to the world, these books. And I would read, like I read, my grandfather had bought Hemingway's complete works from what they used to call a Fuller salesman, whatever, a door salesman. He'd come. And so they were just sitting there on the shelves, and I went straight through all of those.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that, because I could detect some of Hemingway's music in your prose.
Yeah. And what was so great about it, I think, is that I did all of that before any of it was brought to me in school. So I had my own private relationship with these writers. And there was something furtive and wonderful about it for me. You see what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
And then when teachers began to say, well, blah, blah, and blah, blah, it didn't matter to me because I already had my relationship with those writers. So it was really books that opened the world to me.
And did you know that you wanted to be a writer from a young age?
Yes. I thought of myself as a writer from my earliest memory.
And, you talked earlier about your apprenticeship years, before you broke out in your 40s. And you said that you were trying to write like a writer.
I think I was, yeah.
Which writer or which writers? Did you have people that you were imitating?
Well, whoever was in the New Yorker that week, I was probably trying to write like that person. And it took me years to realize that was what I was trying to do, because wasn't conscious, I wasn't fully aware of it at the time. But then later I thought, no, I was trying to be the writer of the week in the New Yorker, whoever it was, and then just realized, no.
Yeah, I found that like in past years, like working on a project of my own and then reading something that's very different, in its voice. And then suddenly I return to my own work and I'm doing this mimicry thing where I'm puppeting the writer that I just read in my own work. And it just takes a while to get out of that habit.
Yeah, exactly. But, it's not a bad thing to do as you're training yourself, but then you have to jump off and do your own thing.
So Olive Kittredge was your third book?
Yeah.
And it won the Pulitzer.
Right.
And there's a great thing your mother, Beverly, said that I want to read because it charmed me, I got to say. Somebody asked her about you winning the Pulitzer. I don't know how old she was when this, was she in her 80s or 90s? She was up in age. And she said, I thought that was fine. At the university, I think she's referring to the university where she worked, there was a professor who won a prize. It wasn't a Pulitzer. And the truth was he won the prize because he had friends on the committee. And I don't think that was fair. I knew it wasn't true of Elizabeth, so I was very proud of her for not cheating.
Exactly. There you go.
So there we have it on the record. Elizabeth Strout did not know anybody on the Pulitzer committee.
Exactly. And I didn't. She's absolutely right. I did not cheat to get the prize.
And I can, there's something very, I don't know, there's something very New England. I guess that would be the way to put it. But you can really detect, I could detect some like echoes of characters like Olive or even Lucy, but especially Olive, that I hear in your mother's voice and tone.
Yeah, that quote is precisely my mother. I couldn't have written it. It's to her.
And there's a character, or there's a part of Lucy Barton's character in Lucy by the Sea that I loved, where, she has a complicated relationship with her mother. She grew up in Illinois in pretty extreme poverty. And one question I had was, why Illinois? Like, how did you land on Illinois as a place?
Yeah, exactly. Because when Lucy and her little voice appeared to me, I realized that I saw sky. I just saw tons of sky with this little house in the middle of Illinois. And my husband and I went out there, probably three times to make sure each season, I had it right. Like I had the soybeans right at the certain time. And we had a Thanksgiving meal at a church, just like Lucy would have done. We drove and we found everything. But exactly. And it was because of sky. And I think there was something very freeing for me to think of that sky and to think, okay, let's just get out of New England and New York and go to the Midwest. And my very first reader, Kathy Chamberlain, who I met in New York the second week I was in New York, Kathy came from Illinois many years earlier. And so when we went out there, we went to see her hometown. I mean, she's not at all like Lucy Barton. Her father was a lawyer. I mean, nothing like that at all. But I think that I had heard enough stories from her about small towns in Illinois that it might have triggered off, like, why to get out of Maine. And then I also understood that, as Lucy Barton's mother tells her, and my name is Lucy Barton, she said, I realized, oh, wait a minute, these are still the people that I come from, because her mother said, don't forget, we were the first settlers here, your family came to Provincetown, and those that were really brave moved westward. So I thought, okay, I'm still with these people. I got their cultural thing going on there. So the brave ones went west.
Well, it spoke to me. I spent part of my childhood, I grew up in the Midwest, but spent part of my childhood in Indiana. So I know that sky.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially the winter when it's gray and just sort of sits there for 5 months or whatever it is.
That in Maine as well.
But Lucy, she had a very difficult youth. She's not particularly close with her siblings, has a complicated relationship with her mother. And a charming aspect of her character is the fact that she has made up a kind of mother 2.0, like a kind, understanding, like empathetic mother to whom she turns in her mind, to ask questions or to receive encouragement or whatever. And I don't know, that I find it kind of like, it's like a little bit funny, a little bit touching, and I'm just
Yeah.
wondering how you landed on that.
I think I'm not sure how I landed on that, but here's my theory looking back because I don't really know when I'm doing something how I got there. But I think because in Olive Again, Isabel Goodrow from Amy and Isabel shows up at Olive's retirement home and they become friends because they were both married to pharmacists. Anyway, Isabel Goodrow at some point when Isabel overhears Isabel speaking to her mother in an entirely different way. And it really freaks Olive out, and she has to go home and think about that. But then Isabel said, I think about my mother and sometimes I talk to her. And it's an entirely different relationship than Lucy has with her made up mother. But I think that probably triggered off like, oh, okay, let's try this. And because Lucy had such a terrible mother, I mean, a difficult mother, and she's imaginative, I thought, okay, let's see if we can go with that.
It's fun to hear you talk about these characters because you really are talking about them like you know them.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Well, I want to ask you about going from obscurity, which most writers live in, to the opposite of obscurity as far as literary fiction goes and writers of literary fiction go. The difference between writing your first novel with this sense of abandon, like, nobody's going to read it anyway, versus putting a novel out nowadays when you have a Pulitzer Prize, people know your name, there's an expectation that a good many people are going to read it, it's going to get reviewed. I'm wondering how this has changed, if at all, your relationship to the writing process and to the entire project. Like, what's the difference and how do you relate to it?
After I won the Pulitzer Prize, I was frightened because I thought now people will look at what I'm going to write. But then very shortly, I realized, I've always held myself to the highest standard. That reader presence that I have in front of me, I've always held myself to the highest standard that I can. I'm just as much of a perfectionist as I can be to try and get it right. And so that won't change, whether it's one reader or 100 readers. I understood because I was older too. I wasn't, thrown by it, I think, in the way that I might have been if I was younger. But I still have a sense of, it's like when I work, I just concentrate so hard on the work, on the characters, on every word, on every sentence, making sure the sentence falls on the ear correctly. All that stuff, I'm just thinking. And then when I lift my head up, I get worried. But then I think, oh well.
Okay, so you've mentioned concentration a lot, and
yeah.
I'm glad that you did, because this work, to do it well, requires that. And I think we live in a culture that increasingly seems to be at odds with deep concentration. So I'm wondering, like, what your relationship is to technology, if you have to impose certain rules on yourself when you're deep into a book, or if maybe your upbringing has helped you in this regard and it has helped you kind of streamline things and keep yourself in a mental space where that kind of concentration is possible.
I honestly think that my very young childhood was probably very helpful with that because I did spend so much time alone, in the woods or anywhere. I mean, at that time, you just let your kid out of the house. If they didn't show up for dinner, you might be worried or not, but there was a lot of freedom, I'm saying. And so I was able to just roam around as a little kid in the woods alone a lot. And I think that sense of being able to have been in my own head at such a young age for such long periods of time has probably been very helpful to me as a writer because there wasn't television, there wasn't anything distracting me. And so I never really learned in a way how to watch TV.
Did you watch the adaptation of Olive Kitteridge?
I did.
Okay. So, like, what's your relationship to TV nowadays? And are you binging because you didn't have it as a kid?
No, I'm not. It's funny. I mean, during the pandemic, there were certain things that I sort of got interested in, but I was never, everybody was always talking about what they were watching, on Netflix or whatever the things were, HBO and stuff. And I just can't seem to do it that much. I like film, but I don't have a relationship with it.
What about your reading habits? Obviously, you read a lot. Any writer who produces books has to be
Right.
reading a lot. But what does it look like? Like, I mean, is it something that just comes so easily to you because you grew up sort of, inhaling books, or is it something you have to like actively carve out time for as like part of your job?
No, I just pick up a book when I'm not writing. I'm always reading if I'm not writing, or, like I'm a terrible housekeeper. I don't cook, so
You read and you write.
I mean, I write basically, and, I walk and I see my friends and stuff like that. But I'm always amazed at how organized people can be in their lives.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I can't seem to do it.
Well, I feel like there's only so much time.
There is.
You have to pick your priorities.
Yeah, exactly. And I just feel like, as long as there's a book that I'm working on that's drawing me to it, that's where I want to be. Even if I'm not actually working on it, I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking, okay, I can almost visualize it and thinking, okay, let's get those two sentences out and let's put this one in, even if I'm not, in front of the manuscript.
Okay, because I was going to ask you. You said you had these periods of intense concentration when you're in your studio or in your apartment working, and I was wondering, like, once you finish a day's work, do you leave the work behind? It doesn't sound like it. You carry it with you.
I don't. I kind of wish I could, but I'm so used to not that it just becomes a part of my life. So no, it stays with me. It does. Yeah, it does. Like I'm always, well, not always, but frequently thinking about it, concentrating, thinking, wait a minute, that's a soggy patch. Okay, tomorrow I'm going to get rid of that soggy patch, and then
What do you mean? What do you mean soggy patch?
like maybe a paragraph or two that after I've spent the day writing it, like I realize, oh, it's soggy. It's not good. It's not sharp. It's not fresh, clean. So I remember that I have to go get rid of that, which I would have done anyway, but that kind of thing.
And when you think of when you kind of assess your own style, I mentioned earlier that I could sense Hemingway music in your prose because there is like there's a crystalline. I was writing an email with your publicist and I was like, it's so vivid. There's a vividness to your writing that I was just so impressed by. And I feel like it's the same with Hemingway. Clarity, vividness, right. Immediacy, a great efficiency in the prose. There's a lot packed into each line.
Right. Get rid of anything that you don't need. Yeah.
Are there other writers that you kind of look to in like a constellation of influences who helped you form your own style?
Yes, I mean, Alice Munro was very, very important to me. She has tremendous authority on the page, for one thing, and I recognize that without even fully understanding what that was. But it's like whatever she wrote, I would go there with her, and she would go in different places. She would do things within her longer short stories that were amazing to me, and I would really study them and look at them. And she wrote about ordinary people. She just wasn't trying for anything bigger than that, but she was doing that brilliantly. And then William Trevor, I've always loved him, and I think of them as sort of bookends to my career because I was always reaching for one or the other of them and studying what they had done, because William Trevor is very gentle, but he can be dark, but he's very gentle in his darkness. And Alice Munro, she's not so gentle if she doesn't feel like it, So it was, those two especially, I think, and the Russians, I've just always loved the Russians because they're so out there with their emotions. But Alice Munro and William Trevor, I think, were very deeply helpful to me.
Yeah, it's funny. There's writers that you latch onto like that, and I find anyway that I can pick up a book that I really love, or any book by a writer that I really love, and it just has like this. It's like it unlocks you.
Yeah.
If I feel like I'm kind of like the well is run dry, I read somebody, even if it's something I've read a million times, and it can bring it back.
Right, exactly.
I have read that you have conceived of your writing as a way of trying to help people, like not to sound precious about it, but you think of like your ambitions as a writer and what you hope to achieve with your books and what you hope unfolds for your reader at the other end of the line. And I don't know if that fully defines it or if you disagree with yourself. I know you said this at one point, but is that how you think of it? Are you trying to...
I think what I'm trying to do, there's a couple of things. I would love it if somebody just read a book and thought, oh, I'm not as alone as I thought I was. That That would be fabulous. Or if somebody read my book and it was almost like the ceiling of the house just got raised a little bit. There was just a little more air around them, like a moment of transcendence, even if it was just for a few moments. Just a sense of, oh, okay, this is only life. I'm not the only person who's had these thoughts. And that would be part of what I'm hoping for. And also I'm hoping that they can read about people who aren't like them and become interested in somebody who's not like them and realize, wow, I never thought of that. I never thought of that section of society that way or something like that. So those are different things. But I remember when I was writing Amy and Isabel, every day, I would walk my daughter to school, and every day as I came back, I would be thinking about the book, and I thought, I just hope one person, if only one person can read that, this is fine. And I pictured that person, oddly enough, to be like a young woman in Illinois. Isn't that interesting?
Interesting.
And I thought, just somebody who feels sort of lonely and she's wandering through the library, and if she could pull this book off the shelf and feel better, that's all I want.
You talked, I think earlier in your life, you had thought of winning a Pulitzer Prize. I guess maybe a lot of writers think about that. But what it's making me think about is there's a kind of magical quality or magical aspect to Lucy, and we talked about her having these visions. And I think there's some truth to this stuff in human experience for certain people who might have, like I call it like a bigger antenna or something.
Yeah.
They're more receptive to these signals, or they can see things that other people can't see. Yeah. Is there any of that for you? Do you as a person find yourself like visualizing things and then manifesting them maybe to a degree that exceeds the norm, or seeing things ahead of time or anything like that, or being able to see into people in ways that are uncanny?
I do feel that I can see into people in ways that feel uncanny. I don't have particular visions the way, Lucy does, but I do feel, and my friends sort of jokingly say, well, Liz has got her finger on the pulse of something else, so I think they're recognizing that I do have like what you call an extra antenna or something, But when I say that I feel that I can see into the lives of other people in an uncanny way, I don't know that I can, because I'm only myself. So there's no way to test how truthful, my imagining is.
Now I'm terrified of what you must be thinking about with me right now. Are you just seeing right into me right now?
No. No.
So I know that you don't like to talk about future work, as many writers do not. You're not somebody who likes to preview what they're working on in public before it's ready, and I will respect that. But a question that I have, I asked you earlier about whether or not this was preconceived, this sort of constellation of novels and this universe that you've created for your characters to inhabit. And it was not. It's sort of been a surprise as you go. But I'm wondering that as the novels have piled up and as the universe has kind of fleshed itself out, if you have developed a grand sense of the larger project, do you have like 4 books in your mind that you still need to write that are going to round it out and finish it? Do you know what I'm saying? Do you have a total sense of it?
I know exactly what you're saying, and the answer is yes.
Okay. Any hints as to how many books you feel like you have left, or?
I only can think about one book ahead at a time. But what's always been interesting for me is that every single time I get close to finishing a book, it will arrive on the horizon, my next book. And I find that to be interesting.
How does it arrive? As a character?
Like I will all of a sudden see, oh, okay, I'll get to you in a minute. Hold on, I got to finish this one up.
So just to drill down into this a little bit more, because I know listeners who write are probably leaning in. You'll be working on a book, it'll be towards the end of it, and then suddenly Lucy will show up and start talking to you.
Right.
It's a voice, it's a scene, is it visual? Like, what are you experiencing?
With Lucy is always her voice. I mean, not her actual voice, but I don't hear her voice. I can just sort of see it and then try and hang on to it. And otherwise, it's a character. It's a character who just presents himself or herself or itself in some manner to me that I realize.
Will you write it down, or will you just hold it in your head?
I'll write it down. I'll start writing it down.
Okay. And I will end perhaps a slightly strange way, because you are, in the world of literary fiction, a writer who has sort of lived the dream. I think that most writers of literary fiction would imagine for themselves, publishing a lot of great books, critically well received, award winning. You've gone on that ride, that I think all of us in some manner dream of. And so you've had great success. And what I'm wondering about is failures, because we all have those too. And I think people in earlier stages of their career can get frustrated by it and might not have a fully developed kind of relationship with failure that you might need to have to persist, right, and to get to where you are. So I'm just wondering about failures that you've experienced, how you related to them maybe back in the day versus how you relate to them now, and what you might have learned.
Well, there's nothing romantic about failures or rejections. It's just, they're awful, because, but I think it's obviously necessary. It was very necessary for me. I mean, to just be rejected and rejected and rejected for so many years. But for me, I do remember understanding that each story I wrote was a little better than the one I had written before. And that kept me going, because I just kept thinking, well, just keep doing it because you will get better. And that's what happened. So I did. And failures, it's funny, like I don't really read reviews of my work. And I think it's because I'm too easily excitable, so I put the book out there and I hope, and then I turn away and
get back to work. Yeah. It's funny. I read a line, I believe it was your husband, who said, like, I work hard, Liz works much harder. Like, you have a really strong work ethic, as I think anybody who publishes a lot of books must. Like, what does a work day look like for you?
I don't have a long-term stamina that I used to. Like, I used to work right after breakfast and stretch it all the way until, maybe 1 or 2 o'clock, until I had to eat something, because lunch it would somehow break it up.
Yep.
And then that would be my stretch of work. And now I find that I probably could work that hard. I mean, but still, there's many different things in between that I do. But what I'm trying to say is that I work in a more fragmented way now. Like, I think, okay, like I walk around and I think, okay, let's go back and get those paragraphs out, and then I do, and it feels almost like embroidery at this point. It's like I don't have the long haul hours that I used to be able to do, and so now I just sort of think, okay, well, let's get these sentences, let's pick this out, let's do it, just a sentence at a time, let's figure this out. So it kind of goes on all day, is my point now. Doesn't really matter when I have lunch anymore, is my point.
But in shorter bursts.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's funny. I've tried to convince people over the years who are not writers that writing, despite the fact that you're kind of inert, just sitting there staring at your screen or your piece of paper, is physically exhausting in ways that would surprise people.
It is so exhausting. Thank you for saying that, because, I mean, it is absolutely exhausting. It's like your viscera is becoming, inside out.
Well, I have so enjoyed talking with you. I'm grateful for the time, and I love the book.
Thank you.
I tore through it, and I have more to read. I haven't read them all, so I'm excited to go back and complete the cycle. It's just a wonderful set of characters in a world that you've created and a body of work that you've created, and it's an honor to get to speak with you. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It was really very, very wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much for everything.
All right, folks, there we have it. That was my conversation with Elizabeth Strout, author of the new novel Lucy by the Sea, available now from Random House. You can find Elizabeth on the internet. Her website is elizabethstrout.com. She's got a Facebook page. You can track her down on Twitter. Her handle over there is @LizStrout. One more time, the novel is called Lucy by the Sea, available from Random House. Go get it, read it. It is absolutely delightful. The Other People podcast is offered freely. It's a listener-supported show, so if you listen to this program regularly, if you like it, if you get something from it, I hope you will consider supporting it. You can do that for as little as $1 per month over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. That's Patreon, patreon.com/otherpplpod. You can support the show for $1 a month, $3, $5, $10, $20, whatever you can swing. And as you move up the scale, you can get stuff. There's merch, t-shirt, an Other People tote bag, sticker, coffee mug, book club subscription. I will send you a postcard. I will wish you a happy birthday, and so on and so forth over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Don't forget to rate and review this podcast over at Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, wherever you listen. It takes 2 minutes and it really does help. Please rate and review the show. Let people know what you think. It helps the podcast find new listeners algorithmically. If you have something to say to me, if you want to offer some feedback, the email address is letters@otherppl.com, letters@otherppl.com. Send word. Let me know what you think. Don't forget to sign up for the newsletter that comes out once a week. That's it, just once a week. Sign up for the newsletter. It's free. You can do that at otherppl.com or at bradlisti.com. It's the same newsletter, wherever you subscribe, whether you go to otherppl.com or bradlisti.com. Don't forget about my novel, Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. It is out there waiting for you. If you would like to read it, you can do so in trade paperback ebook or an audiobook edition narrated by yours truly. Again, it's called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. The Other People podcast has its own official app. Did you know that? It's free. It's a good app. It's a great way to listen. Go get the Other People app. Search for it by name, Other PPL with Brad Listi, wherever you get your apps. And YouTube. I forgot to mention, this podcast has its own YouTube channel, so if you're a YouTube person and you want to listen to this show on YouTube, the entire archive is there. Go search for the show by name, Other PPL with Brad Listi, and hit the subscribe button when you get there. It's free. Subscribe on YouTube. Next week on the program, my guest is Chelsea Martin, author of a terrific new novel called Tell Me I'm an Artist. Happy to be welcoming Chelsea Martin back onto this program. She's an old pal, and her new book is epic. So stay tuned. I'll talk to you soon. All right? I hope you're well out there. Hang in there.